Hey all, today we're going to be going over chapter 3 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. This is chapter 3, the learning process. We've graduated to outside the house, and instead of a whiteboard, I'm going to be just throwing visuals up on screen somewhere over here through editing, because that's easier for me, and I can just keep talking. And also today I'm going to try and vary the voice so it's not so monotone. Let's get into it. Okay. First off, we need to discuss what learning is. Learning is defined as a lot of different things in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, but that's mostly, it all culminates to a change in behavior, right? I can read off some of them. It's a change in behavior of the learner as a result of experience, a permanent change in behavior, the change in behavior that results from experience and practice, and gaining a knowledge of skills or developing a behavior through study, instruction, or experience. All of those are behavior-based, right? So really the goal is to change behavior. There you go. We have different types of learning. You have classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. Classical conditioning is basically an action that creates an involuntary natural stimulus through like associated items, meaning example is like you have food and you put it in front of your dog and your dog drools. You don't teach your dog to drool, it's a natural thing that happens, right? Operant condition is kind of the opposite. It creates a voluntary and associated reaction, such as when your dog paws at the door to go outside, you give it a treat and it's rewarded. This is the classic positive reinforcement sort of thing. Operant conditioning. And then you have social learning, which is learning by observation in a couple different stages. You have attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Basically, attention, you first see it, right? And then retention, you remember what you just saw. And reproduction, you try and reproduce the action that you saw. And motivation, which is the desire to repeat the outcome, either because it felt good, it led to a good outcome, or you get rewarded for it. We also have these are the two bigger ideas that you need to know. We have behaviorism. This is the idea of like what's a good way to put this? The carrot on the stick reaction, right? Or you beat someone because they did the wrong action. This is trying to break an unwanted action through negative reinforcement, right? This is the way we don't want to treat learners, right? So, you know, they mess up a maneuver, you don't beat them with your hand because they messed it up, right? Sure, it creates a negative stimulus, they don't want to mess it up again, but it's not really the type of learning we want to go for. That's what behaviorism is. And then you have the idea of cognitive theory, which is more mind-based, and that's concerned with the idea of like building upon known items until mastery, right? So you take a skill, you build upon it, you can do related items relating to the skill until you have the idea and the outcome that you would like, right? So it's kind of building upon the mind, building upon knowledge, from the simplest theory to the most complex, meaning you have the stages of knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and then finally evaluation. Exactly. There's a few other ideas in here that are presented, such as information processing theory, which is kind of like comparing the human mind to a computer, right? You get input and your brain make output. And then there's also the idea of constructivism, which holds the whole theory of higher order thinking skills, which is basically just scenario-based training and aeronautical decision-making, right? It's the ability to apply your knowledge. And then it has the idea of like effective problem-solving skills. It's kind of the place you want to get the learner to, right? This is under the idea of cognitive theory. And it's where you want to get the learners to apply the knowledge that you're transmitting in a scenario-based real-world situations, right? So we want to build to the cognitive theory area of constructivism with higher order thinking skills. Yeah. So let's get on to perceptions and insights. So perceptions are kind of the basis of how we gain knowledge. All learning comes from perceptions. You watching this video is a perception. Me reading the book in front of me is a perception. basically any amount of knowledge that you put into your brain is a perception. And a perception is defined as giving meaning to information from your senses, right? We all see, if I look to my left, I see a tree. Someone else might see a tree, but they might perceive the tree differently based on how they see the world, right? We all have different emotions and different senses, different emotions that impact them, right? And the perceptions that we gain from the world around us are based on those. That's why different people, everyone is different, everyone reacts to information in a different way, right? So it's affected by a lot of things. We have a few that we need to know, such as the physical organism, which is like how one sees the world around them, right? You have goals and values. That's pretty self-explanatory. Like things that are highly valued are pursued more than things that are not valued. You have self-image. Someone with a better self-image will see the world in a different light than someone with a poor self-image, which is kind of the idea of like negative self-image is a barrier to learning, because people will have worse perceptions of the way they see things around them, right? Time and opportunity. If a learner has more chances to learn, then the frequency of training will cause more learning, right? The more perceptions you take in, the more you will learn, right? The more opportunities you have to experience things, the more you learn. And then elements of threat, which is negative, fear is bad, right? It limits your perceptual field. If you've ever experienced even any sort of like scary situation, you don't really remember like the color the sky was, right? You don't remember what color the car was that was driving 3 feet behind you, right? Because if there's an oncoming car and you have to like swerve to avoid it, all you remember is exactly what was in front of you. Your perceptual field narrows into exactly what was happening, right? And so that kind of limits what sort of information you can take in. This is generally negative. However, we still need to train it in the idea of like scenario-based training. When simulated engine failure, we want to make it as realistic as possible to develop the perceptual field to be able to receive it. And then you have the idea of insights. Now, insights are basically relating perceptions together. A perception is an individual idea, and multiple perceptions that are related form an insight, right? This could be the learner gains information about different things relating to the fuel, the mixture, the engine, and how density and air density works at altitude, and we can form that into an insight of, as I climb in altitude, the air becomes less dense, so I need to lean the mixture so I have an even fuel to air ratio, right? That's an insight because we're combining different perceptions of learning together. The more perceptions you have, the more insights you'll make and the more you'll learn. And that's why frequency of training helps, because you can have more perceptions. Now, we have this different ways we acquire knowledge. This is a 3-step process. I use the acronym MUA, and it's just memorization, which I think of as just like kind of take a shotgun and you just shoot it at everything and you see where the shells go, right? You memorize, it's the learner trying to memorize everything they can about a particular subject, which is pretty standard, right? Every time we want to learn something, we just pick up the book and we read as much as we can, right? And then as we learn more, we build these perceptions, we organize it into an understanding, right? We put pieces together and see where they relate to each other, and we kind of form this big picture of like what's going on, right? So it's memorization and then understanding. Understanding is making that big picture, organizing it into insights, perceptions into insights. And then you have application, and that's kind of the idea of concept learning. This is that higher order thinking, that's the application phase. And so that's what the last phase is application. Formulation of generalized concepts from different facts or different steps, and then being able to apply it to real world situations, right? All right, next we have this is probably the biggest part of the learning process. We have the laws of learning. This is most commonly known by the acronym REAPER. Hopefully you see it up here. And so let's go through it. The first R is readiness. If a learner is not ready to learn, then they will either not be able to learn or have a narrowed perceptual field, or you lose the ability to teach them to the fullest extent, right? This kind of relates back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You want the learner to be able to learn. And then objectives should be, you want your objectives clearly communicated to the learner. You cannot just be like, all right, today we're gonna go fly, right? You want to pre-brief on the ground to let them know, right, this is what I want to achieve, and this is how we're going to do that. And then finally, there's this great idea of the teachable moment. There's a lot of moments in aviation that, they happen once for a learner in training, and they might never happen again until they hit 1,000 hours, right? You want to point out everything that is a teachable moment, right? You want to look for something, a real world application place to apply learning to the, just anywhere you are, right? So there's the idea of the teachable moment. You as an instructor should always be ready to teach the learner, even if it's a scenario that is not planned for the lesson, right? Next is the law of effect. This is the idea that good outcomes are more likely to be repeated, and bad outcomes are more likely to be forgotten. This is beneficial to us, but we can manipulate it to our advantage, right? On a first flight, you don't want to go up with a learner and be like, hey, land the plane. They have no knowledge of landing the plane. They might have never experienced the plane in the reverse region of command. They might have never experienced slow flight, right? They're gonna suck at it. And if you negatively motivate the learner, if you give them a negative experience, it will have a bad outcome. Law of effect says that they are more likely to be demotivated from the experience, right? But we can manipulate this through praise, right? If they do a maneuver correctly, you praise them, it's more likely to be repeated, it's good. I was given the advice that we don't want to inform the learner of the ACS standards until they're close to it, right? And one of the best things you can say to a learner is, I know you didn't know it, but that maneuver was actually in the standards of the ACS. And that's big praise, right? It's more likely to be repeated, they'll do it the same way. That's the law of effect, right? Also, scenario-based training is a big thing there, right? If they have a successful outcome, they'll feel better about it. So, yeah. Law of exercise, this one's pretty simple. Repetition is promote success, use it or lose it, right? That's pretty much it, right? You don't want to take large gaps in training. Self-explanatory. There's the idea of fading, which we'll get to later, but repeating a task makes you better at it. Doing something once will not make check ride ready. There you go. The law of primacy. This is, I would argue, the most important law of learning. Basically, the first time you see something, it's the most impactful impression on you, right? So the book relates it to when an error occurs during a concrete foundation for a building, undoing and correcting the job becomes much, much more difficult than doing it right the first time. So we need to teach it correctly the first time because it's the first time the learner sees it, and it's what gets ingrained in the brain, right? It's really hard to unteach something that was taught incorrectly. So there's just the idea of do it right the first time. Next is the law of intensity. This basically states that immediate and exciting events are more likely to be remembered than something that's routine or boring. This is where scenario-based training is really important, because if we can dramatize it as much as possible, we can create as memorable of an impact on the learner for what it is going to look like in the real world. This is why learning from mistakes and learning from real world scenarios is so much better than just practicing it, because you really have this intensity, oh my gosh, it's really happening. And then you have a lot to take away from it, right? So that's the law of intensity. And then, and then you have the law of recency. This is just the idea of what we learn the latest is best remembered. If I went out and I did a lesson on power off 180s, and then I do 8 lessons on, commercial maneuvers, and then I try and go back to power off 180s like nothing happened, I'm probably going to be worse at it, right? Use it or lose it. Kind of the same thing as exercise. However, exercise is based on repetition. Recency is based on how recent you've done it, right? It's our job to build lesson plans and format our instruction to build on the previous skills, build on previous skills and apply them to new skills in a way to promote recency and exercise. Another big note here is that going back to the idea of primacy, it's hard to overcome primacy, but you can, right? And the best ways to do that are through intensity and exercise. Intensity, exercise, and recency, right? If you do something a lot and you make it real, you can overcome primacy. But at the end of the day, if something is taught incorrectly, really it's just intensity and recency that can overcome it. So there's that. Next, we have the domains of learning. There's 3 domains of learning. We'll just cover them real quick. It's cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Cognitive is thinking, affective is feeling, and psychomotor is doing. Cognitive is all about remembering facts, developing intellectual abilities, skills, basically everything that goes on in the brain that you can apply to the plane. Affective is feelings, which is kind of the whole point of like finding the learning style of a learner and seeing how the learner approaches learning and seeing their motivations and their goals. Psychomotor is the doing portion, where you have like the physical movement, the skills, the coordination, what we would generally call in aviation, stick and rudder, right? The most important here being the cognitive domain. We have the acronym RUAC, which is kind of how we have these basic levels of learning. You start at rote memorization, right? This is being able to just look at a page, read it, and then repeat it back. You don't know what it means, but you remember it, you can repeat it back. This is what you might experience when you first teach a lecture. It has that recency, right? Law of learning, it's a recency. And the learner is able to repeat it back without knowing what it means. And then you have understanding, which is comprehending the meaning of what you're saying back, right? You might not be able to apply it to anything else, but you at least understand what we're talking about, right? Application is putting that learning to use. Maybe that's in the plane, or maybe that's just applying it to a scenario given on the ground. So you're able to demonstrate it, you're able to apply it. And then correlation is actually like associating the understanding and application with maybe a previous topic, or comparing it to another related idea. Basically, we want to achieve the correlation stage. It's common for instructors to stop teaching at application because they think they're fooled into thinking that it's the peak, right? But our goal is to get to correlation, where they can apply the same idea to other related skills and have the same outcome. Yeah. All right, and there's a few characteristics of learning here. First of all, learning is a result of experience, and it's kind of an individual process, right? Everyone has their own way of learning. It varies by person, and the only way to learn a skill is by actually doing it, right? And a person's knowledge is kind of a result of experience, right? It's an individual process. Learning is an active process. You can't just assume the learner remembers something just because they were in the classroom. It's our job to actually get them to respond with emotion and facilitate like different ways that they see the learning process, correct? Learning is multifaceted. It's not just going to be just in the psychomotor domain. It could also be in the affective domain. Well, it spans all the domains, right? We need to be able to apply thinking, psychomotor, and affective all to combine into one experience, right? The learner will learn best when they're able to apply all of their senses into the learning. And also, learning to fly can develop a lot of different areas in the learner's habits and lifestyle. Just learning about the fundamentals of instruction has kind of changed the way that I approach my own learning and the way that I understand kind of how the learning process works. And that's just, that wasn't my goal, but it happened through learning. And so that's the whole idea of learning is multifaceted, right? You get more out of just learning one skill. And then learning needs to be purposeful. everyone sees learning differently. Everyone has different past experiences. That's why learners have to have goals, and that's why we need to understand their own goals for long and short term. Next is learning styles, as if this couldn't get more complicated. Learning styles, same thing. Everyone learns differently, right? We have the idea of right brain and left brain. Left brain people tend to be more analytical, more verbal, versus right brained people, which are a little more creative, more emotional. And while, we are able to employ both, so you will always have a winning side, right? And especially in like stressful situations, you're going to revert back to your default brain, right? I find myself to be more left-brained, more analytical, more verbal, and I can agree that when I'm in like a stressful situation, I find myself talking my way through it, analyzing the best outcome, that sort of stuff. And then there's also the idea of learning styles, and that's through like it's called VAKT: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. Some people learn better through visual learning. Some people are better by listening to it. Some people are better at learning through kinesthetics, which is like their body moving, and some people are better through like tactile, feeling, touch, right? And again, all styles are able to be used to learn in someone, but at the end of the day, there's a winner, right? One of them will win. And then we have to identify that per learner, and we actually have to be conscious about how we're teaching the learner. The book goes on to mention superlinks, which is kind of an interesting thought, but it makes sense when you think about it, right? Everyone has a preferred learning style: visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. And then everyone is right-brained or left-brained. So we can find a way to teach to a right brain visual or left brain auditory. We're going to have the most effective learning, right? That's where we kind of want to bring our attention to, is identifying the super link. And that's what the book really tries to stress with learning styles. Next is the stages of skill acquisition. This is going to be in it's 3 steps really. It's cognitive, associative, and automatic response. Cognitive is the whole rote memorization, your introduction, your memorization, and kind of step-by-step learning, right? And then you have associative. Associative is like practice, right? We can apply it. We'll say cognitive. The cognitive stage is talking about traffic patterns. And then the associative stage is, the learner can fly the traffic pattern, but they really have to apply what was learned on the ground to it, and they can do it, right? And it's through practice, it'll give more coordination. The more you do it, the more it'll get better, right? You can apply it with your senses, muscles, and each attempt should be about the same, maybe improving as you practice it. And eventually you want to get to the automatic response where you can just do it, right? I don't think that hard about flying a traffic pattern. I still have to devote some attention, but I don't have to think that hard about it. And if, tower calls me while I'm middle of a turn putting flaps down on the base leg, I can still respond to tower while automatically putting the flaps down. It's rapid, smooth, expected, and everything is, flowing because it's automatically responding. So those are the 3 stages. You have cognitive, associative, and automatic response. We obviously want to aim for automatic response for everything we're teaching. The other point that's made is that you want to get the learner to a place where they can discover their own mistakes by themselves. We don't want it where, when we're giving feedback, whether we're in the airplane after a maneuver or on the ground, we don't want it to be somewhere that's like, we have to tell them everything they did wrong. If we can get to a point where they identify the error and we can fix the root, flight instruction gets a lot easier for both us and the learner. So that's kind of the job there. It's law of primacy is like, well, let's see. The way I've always been taught to fix a maneuver is you don't want the learner to, when practicing, you don't want the learner to do the whole thing if they did it wrong. You want to stop them and fix it before they do it, because that's the whole idea of primacy, right? If you allow the learner to do something incorrectly all the way through, even though it was wrong, they're going to build that into their primacy, right? It's their foundation, and so we don't want them building incorrect foundations for their learning. And that's why we need to inform them when they're right or wrong as soon as we can, as well as law of effect, right? If you tell them it's wrong, bad outcome, less likely to be repeated. It also goes on that practice, the quality of your skill is directly tied to the number of times practiced. Each mistake that you make is good because it provides clues to how to improve it. And that's our job, again, is to find the root. They can identify the error, we find the root, we fix the root. Now, practicing is good, right? We want to practice, but sometimes you get to somewhere where no matter how many times you practice something, it's not improving. And that's what we call a learner plateau, a learning plateau. And, this is not a bad thing. It's perfectly natural. We've all done it. And it needs to be informed to the learner that it's natural, because otherwise they may lose motivation. They may feel like, they're stuck. They can't do anything about it. And the best thing to do is just move on to another task. But you have to be careful about this, because you cannot just move on to, let's say the learner can't really get the hang of stalls. You can't just move on to oh yeah, let's go do ground reference maneuvers. It doesn't work like that. We have to develop things that, we have to move on to skills that help develop stalls. So we might say, okay, well, we can't get the stalls done, but let's try slow flight for a little more time and see if we can just develop what it feels like to operate the plane with slow airspeeds and maybe needing more rudder. And then we practice turning in slow flight, right? We need more rudder. And then we can come back to stalls and see if we can improve it based on what the area that we just practiced, right? So it's, learning plateau, natural. We inform the learner it's natural, that we don't want them to lose motivation. And then we move on to a related skill that can help improve the skill that is plateaued. Next is types of practice. There's 3 big types. It's going to be a deliberate, which is targeting specific areas with feedback, with no distractions, right? This is just, no distractions, brief corrections, no new ideas. It's just practicing over and over again and targeting specific areas with minimal feedback. This might be something that you do right before a check ride. You're just like, all right, I want to go up and I want to practice these 3 items. You tell me briefly what I do wrong and we can correct them. Boom. Blocked practice. Blocked practice is practicing the exact same skill over and over again until it's automatic. This is getting to that automatic response stage. This is, today we're going to go up and I'm only going to do turning stalls for an hour and a half. Hopefully when you get on the ground, you should be really good at them. What law of learning is that, right? That's law of exercise. If we do it over and over again, we're going to be better at it. The danger here is that it's really good for short term, but bad long term. And it can also really fool the instructor into thinking that the skills are perfected, right? If you go home and come back a week later, that learner might still suck at them. But just because we were getting them automatic, the skill was transitioning from an actual skill into a just repeated response that might lose some of the technique and might turn into just muscle memory, which is not what we want. We don't want muscle memory in the short term. We want automatic response in the long term. So that's the disadvantage of blocked, but it is a good way to pass a check ride, is going up the night before and only practicing the one thing you suck at, because hopefully in the morning you're still pretty good at it. And then the best type of practice is random practice. This is mixing up the practicing of skills, kind of combining blocked practice with deliberate practice, right? And this is how most instructional activities are built. We go up and we do 5 different things, right? Maybe we do 3 chandelles, and then we'll do 2 lazy 8s, and we can do 2 steep spirals, and then we get feedback on both, right? Every time we do one, we give a little bit of feedback, minimal distractions, that's it. All right, the book goes on to talk about multitasking. We can't multitask. I'm sure everyone's heard that it's an urban legend, right? It's not possible, but we can prioritize and sequence tasks really well, and that's kind of why it's impossible to turn into a frog and look two directions at once. But we can do something called task swapping, which is just going back and forth between two different tasks efficiently, right? There is a danger is in that tasks can be prioritized, right? We might go like boom, 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 and then, oh God, I forgot the other task. It happens. It's something we need to be aware of, and we can't teach the student to quote unquote multitask, but we can teach them to prioritize task management, right? And something else we can give them is an increase in workload on purpose, because at some point, the learner is going to get overwhelmed, and we need to teach them what to do when they become overwhelmed. And that's really just staying ahead of the airplane, right? And we can do that by giving them extraneous tasks. Hey, can you look out the window and identify where this is on this sectional? Something random. Oh, I dropped my pen. Just increasing workload management, giving them distractions, giving them interruptions, gives them ideas on what to prioritize, especially once they hit the real world and stuff like that happens. Distractions versus interruptions, I just kind of touched on that, but distractions are momentary diversions. Interruptions is stopping one task and completing another before going back to the original, right? The danger of interruptions is that you stop your task, you go prioritize the other one, but when you come back, you start in the wrong place. This could look like skipping an item on a checklist. So that's like the difference there. And then, especially in students, this is a big one in students, there's the fixation and inattention. Big after instrument, right? Or I'm sorry, big during instrument. Fixating on a single instrument instead of having a scan, right? Fixation is being absorbed in one item and not moving. Inattention is kind of failing to pay attention to any task at all. And this could be from boredom. And so what's something we can do as an instructor is kind of like glance over at their eyes and see where their eyes are going. I don't have any experience with this because I'm not an instructor yet, but I'm sure it works. It's not hard to see where eyes are looking. Next is scenario-based training. I'm not going to cover this because this was talked about in chapter 1, and this is just a summary in chapter 3. We move on to errors. There's two kinds of errors. There's slips and mistakes. A slip is when someone intends to do one thing but accidentally does another. Due to time pressure, it could be due to neglect of an item on accident, but I wanted to turn left and I accidentally turned right. I didn't plan to turn right and I accidentally did. I wanted to turn left. That's a slip. And then the FAA defines a mistake as when someone successfully does the wrong thing on purpose. Such as, I planned to turn right and I did turn right, but it actually was the wrong thing to do. I don't like these definitions, but it's how the FAA wants to define them. And at the end of the day, we're owned by the FAA. So those are the definitions. There's a lot of ways we can reduce error. I'm sure you can already think of 5 of them. But, we want call-outs, right? Reminders, which checklists, the heading bug. We want routines. And while some routines can be considered bad, a routine such as like a flow or doing something the same way every time does help, as long as we don't fall victim to expectation bias. And then consciously raising awareness during a critical phase of flight. That's a really important one. Maybe I'm entering a busy class, Charlie. I need to be alert, focused, listening for my call sign, everything there. And this is kind of the same thing as like giving the student distractions. We need to give them small errors, and we need to give them the ability to learn how to recover from errors, right? And self-assess. Next, we're going to touch on the memory. There's 3 types of memory. long-term and short-term is always covered, but we also have the idea of sensory memory. There's 3 stages of memory: sensory, short-term, long-term, in that order. Sensory is impression-based. These are kind of our perceptions, right? This is how we perceive the world based off our emotions through perceptions. This is for seconds, maybe 3 seconds, right? And then it gets sent to our short-term memory. Our short-term memory is about 30 seconds. It's the put to use memory, this is the applying thing, the applying steps memory. It has limited capacity. It's kind of more rote memorization based. And then we can help our short-term memory through memory aids. And then eventually it gets sent to the long-term memory, which is permanent, generally considered to have unlimited space, and it has a transfer back and forth with the short term. That transfer from long to short term is called recoding, and then the transfer of sensory to short is called precoding. Thanks, FAA. And then what is stored in the long-term memory also affects perceptions, right? Because that's how we see the world from our own experiences. The ability to retrieve info is based on recency and frequency. Again, kind of a law of learning, right? Recency. But if you have recency and you have frequency, it's very easy to remember it. If you have just frequency, but not recency, then it's harder to remember because it was very far in the past. And if you only have recency and you don't have frequency, you haven't practiced it that much, and it cannot be built upon. Kind of going with the memory, we have the idea of forgetting. It's not always bad. I don't want to remember what color the car I drove past driving here 4 hours ago was. That's not important to me. So getting rid of unimportant information creates more room for new stuff. As we learn more, we can have retrieval failure, which is just as simple as it sounds. It's information that didn't make it to the long-term memory. We cannot retrieve it from the recesses of our mind. And then you have fading, which is, kind of what we just talked about. It's non-recency. If I haven't talked about my magnetosystem for 2 years, I'm not going to remember it very well. It's going to fade out of my mind. So that's what fading is. Interference is info overshadowed. Learning one thing kind of makes you forget another, if that makes sense. So it could be similar info that kind of blends together. That's the general example given. Or just material learned poorly. And then finally, you have a repression and suppression. Repression is, we know it as a defense mechanism, but it also is it's unconscious, right? We don't try to repress things. It's unconscious and kind of pushed away because those feelings were bad for us and our brain doesn't want to remember them. That's what repression is. Suppression is conscious. Suppression is us actively trying to not remember items. And then finally, we have the retention of learning. It kind of just gives a lot of different ways that we can help the learner retain knowledge. Praise stimulates remembering. Recall is promoted by association, which is not being ambiguous, and using associated terms to help recall. Favorable attitudes help aid retention along with favorable self-image. So people will only learn what they think is beneficial to them. It's important. Learning with all of our senses is most powerful. It's kind of the multifaceted theory, right? If we're able to learn with our visual, auditory, and kinesthetic senses, and we have cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains all engaged at the same time, we're going to learn better because there's all of our domains of learning all at once. Meaningful repetition and practice aids recall. The more I do it, the more it helped me. Mnemonics are great. I use bajillions of mnemonics. That looks like acronyms, acrostics, stuff like that. Transfer of learning. This is a big one. A positive transfer of learning occurs when a skill helps learn another skill. This looks like, slow flight helps develop landings and takeoffs because we're operating in that same region, right? We want to teach slow flight before we teach someone to land, because then they'll be better at operating at those slow, kind of sloppier airspeeds. For that reason, negative transfer is when skill A hurts the learning of skill B. I don't really have a good example for this. I probably should have prepared one. But we want to avoid negative transfer. We should do everything in a logical order that benefits the learner in how they learn, right? And then we just want to foster that positive transfer through effective lesson planning. We want to give the learner habits through both how we act as a flight instructor and how we teach. That's kind of the idea of primacy. What else? Learners remember during their own training. So if a learner does something to help themselves, such as like make note cards, they're more likely to remember it based on me just sitting here doing a lecture on how to learn, right? If I sit there and I do a lecture on the systems, they're not going to learn it as well as if they went and they drew out their own systems. So we want to encourage learners to seek other forms of learning other than us just standing in front of them lecturing. And that's about it. That was chapter 3 of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, the learning process. Thank you.